Starting in 1953, Turkish-born social scientist Muzafer Sharif received $38,000 from the Rockefeller Foundation to secretly run an experiment on a real-life boys' summer camp. Both the boys and their parents were kept unaware of the experiment and any of the money funding it. In their minds, this was just a normal 3-week summer camp. And let me read you the summary of what happened at that summer camp. Intrigued with the issue of intergroup conflict, Sharif decided to investigate the process as it developed in boys' summer camps. Although the boys never realized that they were participants in an experiment, Sharif and his associates consistently engaged in artful manipulation of the camp's social environment to observe the effects on group relations. It didn't take much to bring on certain kinds of ill will. Simply separating the boys into 2 resident cabins was enough to stimulate a we versus them feeling between the groups, and assigning names to the 2 groups, the Eagles and the Rattlers, accelerated the sense of rivalry. The boys soon began to demean the qualities and accomplishments of the other group, but these forms of hostility were minor compared to what occurred when these experimenters purposely introduced competitive activities into the factions' meetings with one another. Cabin against cabin treasure hunts, tug-of-war, and athletic contests produced name-calling and physical friction. During the competition, members of the opposing team were labeled cheaters, sneaks, and stinks. Afterwards, cabins were raided, rival banners were stolen and burned, threatening signs were posted, and lunchroom scuffles were commonplace. At this point, it was evident to Sharif that the recipe for disharmony was quick and easy. Just separate the participants into groups and let them sit for a while in their own juices. Then mix them together over the flame of continued competition, and there you have it. Cross-group hatred at a roaring boil. Something about this sounds a little bit familiar, right? 2 groups split up, named after animals. People are fighting each other, name-calling, attacking each other, demeaning each other. Sounds a lot like politics. So in this real-life experiment with 11-year-old boys, you've got one group that's burning the other's banners. You've got another group calling the other group cheaters. You've got this back and forth fighting and contention between the 2. They're leaving threatening signs. And on top of that, one raids the other's cabins. Kind of sounds like our 2-party system in America right now, doesn't it? Now, this experiment came to be known as the Robbers Cave experiment, and social scientists will tell you that this is one of the best examples of conflict theory in real life. But what I think is so interesting about it is it shows us just how easy and quickly humans can be manipulated into having an us versus them mentality, that sort of tribal mentality where I hate somebody else or some other group, to the point where maybe we're even choosing violence like the kids in this camp did, right? And the thing that's the craziest about this is these are reasons that these kids have manufactured in their heads that don't have a lot of factual basis, or if there is a factual basis, it only happened after the board was set for these 2 groups to hate each other in the first place. In other words, all of this was manipulation. These kids manufactured it, they took the bait and they ran with it. But the thing is, conflict theory applies to more than just kids. It applies to everybody. And look at the stage and the conditions that were set up for these boys that made them hate each other. They were physically separated and made to compete against each other in summer camp games like tug-of-war. Even with the stakes being as low as a tug-of-war game, they still found a way to hate each other, right? What does that tell us? This book actually boils it down really well. At this point, it was evident to Sharif that the recipe for disharmony was quick and easy. Just separate the participants into groups and let them sit for a while in their own juices. Then mix them together over the flame of continued competition. And there you have it, cross-group hatred at a roaring boil. Do you think it's a coincidence that America only has 2 political parties? We've got one of the most diverse countries in the world. We've got immigrants from hundreds of countries, freedom of speech, freedom of religion, free enterprise. We've got all this diversity, but we only have the diversity of thought to make up 2 political parties. Does that make sense to you? We've had some of the greatest minds of modern history live in America. Nikola Tesla, Albert Einstein. And even with all these great minds, we've only got enough ideas to comprise 2 political parties. Does that make sense to you? Isn't it interesting how when there's issues that actually affect the middle class, things like immigration laws, labor laws, deficit spending, there's always some sort of division. There's always an us versus a them. But when it comes to issues that impact our politicians and specifically their money, there's no division. There's no us versus them. It's quiet. When's the last time that you heard a politician not want a new foreign war and not want to sign off on billions more worth of military spending, right? When's the last time that you heard a politician with stock in Pfizer tell you that getting the jab was your choice and not something mandatory? This is what the elites love to do. This is their playbook, divide and conquer the people. And this experiment shows us just how easy that is. First, you separate the people, and then you make them compete against each other. The one bit of beauty in this crazy experiment, though, is that it also shows us how to reunite two divided groups and bring them together. Check this out. A more challenging issue now faced the experimenters: how to remove the entrenched hostility that they had created. They constructed a series of situations in which competition between the groups would have harmed everyone's interests, in which cooperation was necessary for mutual benefit. On a day-long outing, the single truck available to go into town for food was found to be stuck. The boys were assembled and all pulled and pushed together until the vehicle was free and on its way. In another instance, the researchers arranged for an interruption in the camp's water supply. Presented with the common crisis and realizing the need for unified action, the boys organized themselves harmoniously to find and fix the problem before the day's end. In yet another circumstance requiring cooperation, the campers were informed that a desirable movie was available for rental, but that the camp could not afford it. Aware that the only solution was to combine their resources, the boys rented the film with pooled money and spent an unusually congenial time enjoying it together. The consequences, though not instantaneous, were nonetheless striking. Conjoint efforts towards common goals steadily bridged the rancorous rift between the group. Before long, the verbal baiting had died, the jostling in lines had ended, and the boys had begun to intermix at the meal tables. In one revealing episode, the boys were returning from a campfire on a single bus, something that would have produced bedlam before, but was now significantly requested by the boys. When the bus stopped at a refreshment stand, the boys from one group decided to treat the other group to milkshakes. We can trace the roots of this surprising turnabout to those times when the boys had to view one another as allies instead of opponents. Common goals that require cooperation. That's how the staff in this experiment were able to bridge the divide between these two groups. And in this experiment, that solution was brought from an outside force. When you talk about real life, it seems like we don't have that outside force. It seems like when this happens for us and we have these common goals, it seems to sort of happen at random. And one example of this in recent memory is 9/11. This is a time where America came together, really unified for a minute, and had a common goal of destroying a common enemy. But since then, if you think about it, how many of our leaders have sort of found that common goal for Americans to identify behind, to get together and cooperate on? It's virtually nothing, right? And that's because we don't have any synergistic leaders. Most politicians really don't benefit from bringing Americans together. The division actually helps them and gives them more power. So you know me, I like to be constructive, and if this is the situation that we're in, I have to ask, what can we do? What can we do to give people a common goal, sort of incentivize cooperation and bring people together so that we're looking at each other as real people and loving one another rather than adding on to the division? And right now, it really does seem like our politicians are more incentivized to sort of divide us because they really do profit off of it. And this is why I think another great awakening in America is really needed at this point. If we had sort of a religious revival where people are really coming to grips with, what do I believe? What is my faith in? What is my greater purpose? And they're working towards that with a group of others in their faith, right? Trying to sort of get to know God, get to know the Lord, sort of getting to know his words, which are actually cohesive towards a cooperative society anyways. I think that we can sort of bypass the politicians and do this as a culture. Bring people together, be cooperative as a culture. Because again, we don't have any synergist politicians right now. They profit off of the division. This is going to happen from the culture level. And this is where people say too, that politics is downstream from culture. Essentially, whatever the culture of the day says will eventually dictate our politicians and our politics of the future. So I have to look at this and say, maybe it's time for another great awakening. Maybe it's time that we embrace faith and ask the tough questions. What do we believe, and who should we get with for our faith?